The newspaper clipping had yellowed at the edges, but her face remained sharp as winter morning. Those eyes that had haunted drawing rooms and scandalized dinner parties now stared back at him from crumpled newsprint. Boone Maddox had carried that photograph in his coat pocket for 3 months, not knowing why, until she appeared at his cabin door like a ghost made flesh, whispering those desperate words that cut through the mountain silence. The escaped princess had found her way to his wilderness, but she didn't know that her secrets had arrived long before she did. Subscribe to discover what happens when the past refuses to stay buried, and two broken souls realize that sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't being found, it's allowing yourself to be saved. The knock came at sunset, soft as deer hooves on pine needles. But Boone Maddox knew the difference between animal and human desperation. He'd been stirring beans over the fire when the sound froze him mid-motion, the wooden spoon suspended like a question mark in the growing dusk. 3 years of solitude had sharpened his instincts to razor edges, and every fiber in his body screamed that whoever stood beyond his door carried trouble in their bones. The wind through the Douglas firs whispered warnings he'd learned to heed, but something deeper, something that lived in the marrow of loneliness, urged him toward the heavy oak door. His hand hesitated on the iron latch, knowing that some visitors changed everything, that some moments split a man's life into before and after with the clean precision of an axe through heartwood. The knock came again, weaker this time, and he heard something that made his chest tighten with recognition he couldn't yet name. When Boone opened the door, the woman standing in his threshold looked like she'd been carved from shadow and starlight, her dark hair escaping from what had once been an elegant arrangement, her traveling dress torn and muddied from days of hard riding. She was beautiful in the way that broken things sometimes are, sharp edges catching light, dangerous to touch but impossible to ignore. Her eyes, wide and desperate as a cornered doe's, met his for one electric moment before she spoke the words that would haunt him. "Don't tell anyone I was here." The plea fell from her lips like a prayer to a god she wasn't sure existed, and Boone felt something shift in his chest. Some long, dormant protective instinct stirring to life. She swayed on her feet, exhaustion and fear warring in her pale face, and he realized she was waiting for his answer, like a woman waiting for salvation or damnation. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths and the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. But Boone already knew her face, had memorized every curve and shadow from the newspaper clipping that had somehow found its way into his possession months ago. Eleanor Langford, the society darling who'd vanished from San Francisco in a cloud of scandal and speculation, leaving behind a trail of broken engagements and whispered accusations. The papers had called her everything from a fortune hunter to a fallen angel. But standing here in his doorway, she looked like nothing more than a woman running from ghosts that refused to stay buried. He'd read about her disappearance, about the search parties and the reward money, about the family that had disowned her and the society that had turned its back. Now she stood before him like an answer to a question he'd never dared ask. And the irony wasn't lost on him that the most wanted woman in California had found her way to the one man who'd sworn off wanting anything at all. The recognition burned in his throat like whiskey, but he swallowed it down, knowing that some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. "Ma'am," he said finally, his voice rusty from disuse, "you look like you could use some help." The words felt inadequate, like trying to hold an ocean in a teacup, but they were all he had to offer. She studied his face with the intensity of someone who'd learned to read danger in men's eyes, searching for the trap she was certain lay hidden beneath his courtesy. Her hands trembled at her sides, and he could see the war being fought behind her careful composure, the desperate need for sanctuary battling against the learned wariness of a woman who'd been betrayed too many times. The mountain wind picked up, sending pine needles skittering across the porch like tiny messengers of winter's approach, and she shivered in her inadequate dress. Boone stepped aside, gesturing toward the warmth of his cabin, knowing that this simple act of hospitality would complicate his carefully ordered world in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The firelight spilled across the threshold like an invitation, and for a moment they both stood suspended in the space between stranger and sanctuary. She hesitated at the threshold, as if crossing it would seal some unspoken pact between them, her eyes darting from his face to the warm interior of the cabin and back again. "I don't even know your name," she whispered, and there was something achingly vulnerable in the admission. As if names held power she wasn't ready to surrender. Boone felt the weight of his own secrets pressing against his ribs, the careful isolation he'd built around himself like armor suddenly feeling thin as paper. He'd come to these mountains to escape the complications of human connection, to find peace in the simple rhythms of survival and solitude. But this woman carried complications in her very bones. Her presence here was impossible, dangerous, and yet he found himself stepping further aside, making room for her in his sanctuary. The beans were burning on the fire, filling the cabin with the acrid smell of his neglect, but neither of them moved to tend them. They stood locked in this moment of decision, two broken souls, recognizing something familiar in each other's damage. "Boone," he said at last, the name falling between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. "Boone Maddox." She nodded as if filing the information away in some secret catalogue of debts and obligations, then stepped across his threshold with the careful grace of someone who'd learned that every sanctuary could become a prison. The door closed behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo through the mountains, sealing them both into a story that had been written in the stars long before either of them knew they were searching for it. The fire crackled and hissed, casting dancing shadows on the log walls, and Boone realized that his 3 years of carefully cultivated solitude had just come to an end with the arrival of a woman whose very existence was a contradiction. A princess who'd chosen exile, a scandal who sought silence, a secret that had somehow found its way to the one man who understood the weight of running from the past. She moved through his cabin like a ghost, learning to be solid again, her fingers trailing over the rough-hewn furniture and simple belongings with the wonder of someone discovering a foreign country. Boone watched her from the corner of his eye as he salvaged what he could of their dinner, noting how she paused at his bookshelf, a collection of worn volumes on trapping, wilderness survival, and a few dog-eared novels that had survived his journey into exile. The way she touched the spine of a poetry book, reverently and with surprise, told him more about Eleanor Langford than any newspaper article ever could. She was educated, refined, but there was hunger in her examination of his simple life, as if she were trying to understand how a person could exist with so little and yet seem so complete. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that comes when two people recognize they're both carrying secrets too heavy for casual conversation. When she finally settled into the chair across from his small table, accepting the plate of beans and hardtack he offered, her hands shook only slightly, and he pretended not to notice. "How long have you been running?" The question escaped him before he could stop it, and he saw her freeze with the spoon halfway to her mouth. It was too direct, too knowing, but something about her presence had stripped away his usual caution like bark from a lightning-struck tree. She set down the spoon carefully, as if it were made of glass, and studied his face with those remarkable eyes that seemed to see straight through to his bones. For a moment, he thought she might bolt, gather her torn skirts and flee back into the wilderness rather than answer. But instead she laughed, a sound so bitter and beautiful it made his chest ache. "How did you know?" she asked, and there was no accusation in it, only a weary kind of relief, as if she were tired of pretending to be someone she wasn't. The admission hung between them like smoke from the fire, and Boone realized they'd crossed some invisible line from stranger to conspirator without either of them meaning to. He could have lied, could have claimed it was just a lucky guess based on her appearance and circumstances. but something in her eyes demanded honesty. Instead, he rose from the table and walked to the wooden chest beside his bed, his movements deliberate and careful as a man approaching a sleeping bear. The newspaper clipping was exactly where he'd left it, folded between the pages of his journal like a pressed flower, and when he returned to the table and spread it before her, he watched her face crumble like a dam giving way to flood. The photograph was months old, taken at some society function before her world had collapsed, but it captured something essential about her, the way she held herself like a woman balancing on the edge of a cliff, beautiful and terrified and utterly alone. "Eleanor Langford," he said quietly, and her name on his lips sounded like both benediction and curse. She stared at the image of herself as if looking at a stranger, her fingers tracing the edges of the newsprint with something approaching grief. "She's dead," Eleanor whispered. And Boone understood she wasn't talking about a literal death, but something far more profound. The death of identity, of belonging, of the person she'd been forced to become in order to survive. "I killed her the night I left San Francisco, buried her in the clothes I threw in the bay before I rode north." The words came out in a rush, as if a dam had finally burst inside her, and Boone found himself leaning forward, drawn into the gravity of her confession. She told him about the engagement that had been more business transaction than love affair, about the scandal that had erupted when she discovered her fiancé's true nature, about the family that had chosen reputation over truth and left her to face the wolves alone. Her voice never rose above a whisper, but there was steel in it, the kind of strength that comes from surviving the unsurvivable. As she spoke, the fire burned lower, casting longer shadows across the cabin walls, and Boone realized he was witnessing something sacred, the moment when a person stops running from their story and starts owning it instead. When she finished, the silence that followed was different from before, heavier, more intimate, charged with the electricity that comes when two people have seen each other's wounds and chosen not to look away. Boone reached across the table and covered her hand with his, a gesture so simple and unexpected that she gasped as if he'd touched her with fire. His hands were rough from years of hard living, scarred from traps and axes and the thousand small violences of wilderness survival, but his touch was gentle as prayer. "You're safe here," he said, and the words carried the weight of a vow, though neither of them understood yet what that promise would cost. Eleanor looked down at their joined hands, as if she couldn't quite believe they were real, and when she looked up again, there were tears in her eyes that she refused to let fall. The woman in the newspaper clipping had been polished and perfect, a society darling playing her assigned role, but the woman sitting across from him was raw and real and infinitely more beautiful for her brokenness. The night deepened around them, and neither made any move to separate, to retreat to the careful distance that safety demanded. Instead, they sat in the flickering firelight, two refugees from different kinds of wars, and slowly began to understand that sometimes salvation comes not from running away from your past, but from finding someone brave enough to sit with you in the ruins and help you build something new from the ashes. Eleanor's hand remained under his, warm and trembling and alive, and Boone felt something he'd thought dead forever stirring in his chest. Not just desire, though that was there too, but something deeper and more dangerous. Hope. The escaped princess had found her sanctuary, but she'd also found something far more perilous. A man who looked at her and saw not the scandal or the society darling, but the woman beneath it all, fierce and fragile and worth protecting with his life. The morning came with frost painting the cabin windows like delicate lace, and Nora woke to the sound of an axe splitting wood outside. She lay still for a moment, listening to the rhythmic thud that seemed to echo the beating of her own heart. Through the thin walls, she could hear Boone's steady breathing between each swing, and something about that sound made her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't name. She had slept in his bed while he took the floor, and the kindness of that gesture sat heavy in her throat like unshed tears. The quilt still smelled of pine and leather, of a man who lived simply but with dignity, and she found herself pressing her face deeper into the fabric, stealing one more moment of this strange peace before the world came crashing back. When she finally emerged, wrapped in one of his oversized flannel shirts, Boone was stacking wood against the cabin's north wall. His movements were efficient, practiced, but she caught the way his shoulders tensed when he heard the door creak open. He didn't turn around immediately, and in that hesitation, she read volumes about the careful distance he was trying to maintain. The newspaper clipping lay folded on the kitchen table where he'd left it the night before, and seeing it there in the morning light made her stomach clench with fresh shame. She had run so far, changed so much about herself, but the past had followed her here like a bloodhound, relentless and patient. The headline seemed to mock her even from across the room. Society heiress vanishes after scandal rocks elite circles. "Coffee's hot," Boone said without turning around, his voice carefully neutral. But she heard the underlying tension, the way he was working to keep things normal, when nothing about this situation was normal at all. She poured herself a cup from the pot on the wood stove, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic and letting the bitter brew ground her in the present moment. Through the window, she could see the endless expanse of wilderness that had become her refuge, but now it felt different somehow, smaller, as if Boone's knowledge of her identity had shrunk the world back down to a manageable size. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had come here to disappear, but being seen by this man felt more real than anything she'd experienced in years of society parties and carefully orchestrated appearances. "You don't have to pretend you don't know," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air between them like smoke, and she watched his shoulders go rigid before he finally turned to face her. His eyes were guarded, but she caught something else there too. A flicker of understanding that made her breath catch. He had secrets of his own, she realized, wounds that ran just as deep as hers, and maybe that was why he hadn't turned her away when any sensible man would have. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths and the weight of recognition that went both ways. She had seen something in his face last night, too, a flash of pain that spoke of losses and betrayals that had driven him to this isolated existence. Knowing and caring are different things, Boone said finally, his voice rough with something that might have been tenderness. He set down the axe and took a step closer, and she could see the conflict playing out across his weathered features. Part of him wanted to protect her, she could tell, but another part was afraid of what her presence might cost them both. The morning light caught the silver threads in his dark hair, and she found herself noticing the way his hands moved, careful and sure, like a man who had learned to be gentle through hard experience. There was something about him that called to the broken places inside her, a recognition that went deeper than newspaper headlines or whispered gossip. The sound of horses approaching shattered the fragile intimacy of the moment, and they both froze as the thunder of hoofbeats grew closer. Boone's hand moved instinctively to the rifle mounted above the door, and Nora felt her heart slam against her ribs as all her worst fears crystallized into reality. They had found her somehow, despite all her careful planning and desperate flight into the wilderness. But as Boone peered through the window, his posture relaxed slightly, and she saw him shake his head. "Just old Pete from the mining camp," he said, but his voice carried a warning that made her blood run cold. But if he's riding this hard, it means words getting around about strangers in these parts. Pete Garrison rode his horse hard up the mountain trail, his weathered face grim with the kind of news that traveled fast in small communities. He was a man carved from the same rough timber as the mountains themselves, all sharp angles and hard-earned wisdom. And when he pulled up outside Boone's cabin, the look in his eyes made Nora's stomach drop like a stone. She pressed herself against the kitchen window, watching as the two men spoke in low, urgent tones, their breath forming clouds in the crisp morning air. Even from a distance, she could read the tension in their body language, the way Pete kept glancing toward the cabin, as if he could sense her presence through the walls. The conversation lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours before Pete mounted up again and rode back down the mountain, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy with impending doom. Boone came back inside with his jaw set in a hard line, and the careful distance he'd been maintaining all morning evaporated in the face of whatever Pete had told him. "There's men asking questions in town," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the weight of bad news. "Fancy-dressed fellows with too much money and not enough sense about mountain ways. They're showing around a photograph, offering a reward that's got every desperate soul within 50 miles thinking about easy money." Nora felt the blood drain from her face as the reality of her situation crashed over her like a cold wave. She had been naive to think she could simply disappear, that her father's influence and resources wouldn't eventually track her down even here in the wilderness. The net was closing around her, and she could feel the walls of her sanctuary beginning to crumble. "How long do I have?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Inside, she was screaming, but something about Boone's presence gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. He was studying her with those penetrating eyes, and she could see him weighing options, calculating risks with the methodical precision of a man who had survived by thinking 3 steps ahead. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed different now, less golden and more harsh, illuminating the dust motes that danced between them like tiny omens of change. She thought of the life she'd left behind, the suffocating expectations and endless performances, and realized that even facing capture, she couldn't bring herself to regret the choice that had brought her here. "Pete says they're planning to search the old mining camps first, work their way up the mountain systematic-like," Boone replied, moving to the window and scanning the tree line with the practiced eye of a man who knew how to read danger in the landscape. "That gives us maybe 2 days, 3 if we're lucky, and they get slowed down by the weather." The word "us" hung in the air between them, and Nora felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the stove. He wasn't going to abandon her, wasn't going to turn her over for the reward money that could probably buy him comfort for the rest of his life. The realization hit her like a physical blow, this unexpected kindness from a man who owed her nothing and had every reason to want her gone. "Why?" she whispered, the question torn from somewhere deep inside her. "Why would you risk everything for someone you barely know?" Boone turned from the window then, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. There was pain there, old and deep, but also something else, a recognition that went beyond the newspaper clippings and society scandal. He saw her, really saw her, in a way that no one ever had, and the intensity of that gaze made her feel naked and exposed and somehow, impossibly, safe. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of unspoken truths and the growing awareness that whatever was happening here was bigger than either of them had bargained for. "Because I know what it's like to run from something that won't let you go," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "And because some things are worth the risk." The words hit her like a physical blow, and she felt tears she'd been holding back for months finally spill over. In that moment, standing in his simple cabin, with danger closing in from all sides, Nora felt more herself than she had in years of carefully constructed performances. The woman who had fled into the wilderness was finally beginning to emerge from the shadows of the society princess she'd been forced to play, and it was terrifying and exhilarating and absolutely necessary. Whatever came next, she knew she would face it as herself, not as the carefully crafted image that had been her prison for so long. The abandoned mining village of Copper Creek sat like a ghost in the valley below, its weathered buildings and rusted equipment telling the story of dreams that had died hard in the unforgiving mountain soil. Boone led Nora down the treacherous path as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the skeletal remains of what had once been a thriving community. She could feel the weight of history in this place, the echoes of men who had come seeking fortune and found only heartbreak and empty promises. The wind whistled through the broken windows of the old saloon, creating a mournful song that seemed to speak directly to the hollow places in her own heart. This was where they would make their stand, Boone had decided, in this place where other people's dreams had come to die. "There's a mine shaft about a quarter-mile up the ridge," Boone explained, as they picked their way through the debris of collapsed buildings and rusted mining equipment. "Goes deep enough that you could hide there for days if you had to. And there's a back entrance that comes out near the creek." His voice was steady, practical, but she could hear the underlying tension that spoke of a man preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. The plan was simple in its desperation. If the searchers found them here, she would run for the mine, while he bought her time with whatever means necessary. The thought of him facing armed men alone made her stomach clench with fear. But when she tried to protest, he silenced her with a look that brooked no argument. As they explored the ruins, Nora found herself studying Boone's face in the fading light, memorizing the lines around his eyes and the way his mouth set when he was thinking hard about something. There was a possibility, growing stronger with each passing hour, that this might be their last day together, and the thought filled her with a grief so sharp it took her breath away. She had known him for less than 48 hours, but somehow he had become essential to her in a way that defied logic or reason. The connection between them felt ancient, inevitable, like something that had been waiting years to finally happen. In the space of 2 days, he had shown her more genuine care and understanding than she had received in a lifetime of society relationships. "Tell me about before," she said as they settled into the old Assayas office, the most intact building in the ghost town. "Before you came to the mountains." Boone was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer, but then he began to speak in a voice so low she had to lean closer to hear him. He told her about the war, about coming home to find his wife had died of fever while he was gone, about the way grief had eaten him alive until he couldn't stand to be around other people anymore. His words painted a picture of loss so profound that it made her own trouble seem small by comparison, and she understood finally why he had chosen this isolated existence. He was running too, just from different demons, and maybe that was why they had recognized each other so instantly. The sound of approaching riders reached them just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold that seemed ominous in the growing darkness. Boone was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, his body coiled with the tension of a man preparing for violence. Through the broken window, they could see the search party picking their way carefully down the mountain trail, their horses stepping delicately over the loose stones and fallen timber. There were 5 of them, well-armed and determined, and Nora felt her heart sink as she recognized the lead rider, her father's head of security, a man who had never failed to complete an assignment. The net had finally closed around her, and there was nowhere left to run. "Go," Boone whispered urgently, his eyes never leaving the approaching riders. "Take the path to the mine shaft and don't look back, no matter what you hear." But Nora found herself frozen, unable to move, unable to leave him to face this alone. The thought of running while he stood his ground went against everything she had discovered about herself in these mountains, everything she had learned about who she really was, beneath the layers of society conditioning. She had spent her whole life running from difficult situations, letting other people fight her battles and clean up her mistakes. But standing here in this ghost town with danger closing in, she realized she was tired of being the kind of person who always chose the easy way out. "No," she said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "We face this together, or we don't face it at all." Boone turned to look at her then, and she saw something shift in his expression. A recognition that the frightened society girl who had stumbled into his cabin was gone, replaced by a woman who had finally found her backbone. The moment stretched between them, heavy with the weight of a choice that would define everything that came after, and in his eyes she saw not just acceptance, but something that looked remarkably like pride. Whatever happened next, they would meet it as equals, as partners, as two people who had found something worth fighting for in the most unlikely of places.